Food.
Let's talk about food.
Such an emotional component
It
to
is
food.
an emotional component.
To not be satiated by food is a very human need. When you go back to like biology, and how disruptive not having your needs met.
Maslow's needs.
Yeah. Maslow's hierarchy is, no joke.
Space food is, when we started the shuttle program, we had come a little ways from the tubes that they had in the early days. You saw those pictures where, we had mostly dehydrated food. It was very much like camping food. I mean, I've done a lot of backpacking, and so I'm used to that kind of food. It's not great, but as I say, hunger is the best cook.
There was an interest for some of the early missions to the moon to have long duration EVAs and to have some kind of high nutrient food bars that crew members could eat to keep them going. And our team stood up to that and created them, but when they failed the taste test.
All the nutrition and everything you need just to have the energy to have your body work properly. It starts there because it's what you take in, and
it's your fuel.
It's your fuel, and so if your fuel is not as efficient or is not palatable in the sense that you now want to eat more or enough because you're tired of eating the same granola bar for a month. You're going to eat less of it, or you're going to eat just enough, and then now you're not working optimally because you don't have the energy you need, you don't have the nutrition you need. So to me, the food system is important, and I just think about my life on Earth. Like, I enjoy going out and dining and eating a lot of it brings me, it helps me thrive.
Eating and drinking can be a challenge. When I first started eating on Space Station, we loved to sit around the table or float around the table in Node 1 and chit chat and talk about the day and our families. Early on, I wasn't involved in those conversations. I was just focused on eating and not choking because it's so easy to drink something and have little bits floating near you. And you got to make sure you get it all down before you start talking because there could be droplets there, waiting to choke you up. So again, spaceflight takes concentration.
On the U.S. side, we had 3 steaks every 9 days. And I just wasn't a really big meat person. And I knew that my Russian crewmates really loved meat. And so I'd be like, hey, my barbecue beef, you want that? You want my steak? I mean, sometimes, okay, I would actually use that. Like, so you have that exercise time, and I would like that exercise time, and I have an extra steak.
It is a golden age of eating in space right now. Why? Because station is huge, resupply is frequent, it's international. When I was up there, we had Japanese food, we had, I hate to say, canned truffles and oysters. Our Belgian crew member ate very well and shared. We had smoked salmon from Canada.
I have to imagine that food is going to be a source of some satisfaction, or the opposite in kind of that, I guess, that how people psychologically evolve under those circumstances. So I would say, yeah, I think it's important that people remain happy as much as possible when they're so disconnected from Mother Earth.
People asked me what was my favorite food up there. I don't know about saying favorite, but before every dinner, I would have shrimp cocktail. Not because the shrimp were great. They were dehydrated shrimp, and they had the consistency and taste of kind of cardboard. But they were packed in a really spicy horseradish sauce, which would open up my nasal passages so I could actually smell my food.
And some things that were really nice. Refried beans. Refried beans were nice because they were easy. You could just take them out, slap them on a tortilla or a cracker, and they taste good. They were nice, salty, but they also are good for sticking other things too. So they were like food glue, and they just worked out really nice. Very convenient for weightlessness.
There's been examples of food being 3D printed. The specific example I can think of is pizza. Which, if you think about a pizza, is essentially layer and layer and layer of food, right? So you got a crust, you got a tomato sauce layer, cheese layer, toppings layer, et cetera, et cetera. Right. I mean, so you lay it out. So the feedstock is still got to come from somewhere. That's the problem. So you can understand like just the assembly of it and make sense, and you can probably heat it in such ways so that it's it's enjoyable to eat because you're used to maybe some people like cold pizza, but most people like hot pizza. But the challenge now comes with the feedstock. Like, where does the crust layer come from? Where does the cheese layer come from? It doesn't just appear, right? Mm-hmm. So you still need the source of the feedstock. Mm-hmm. And so that's So there is that part of it. And so how do we get that supply chain in?
It's going to have to be something very different, I think, than what we do now on the space station. We resupply to the station. You know, every couple months there's big boxes of new food coming. That's not happening on the way to Mars, right? So what we take is what we're going to have with us. I think we have to revolutionize the food system. I really and truly do. And that's not just from the shape, form, you know, presentation of the food. It's also from the nutritional aspect of the food.
Your body is an incredibly energy efficient machine. So not only are you not working against gravity, you know, 20 hours a day or 16 hours a day vertically, there's just no demand of gravity whatsoever.
So the caloric requirements are actually lower in zero G?
Absolutely not.
Are we actually tracking the caloric intake?
There have been several attempts at it. It's not as easy in a precise manner, clearly in space, that it is on the ground, where you would need like a lot of gas exchange and really micromanage input and output. But there have been studies that have measured food consumption and then changes in body mass over time to understand how do we calculate it.
You don't go into space to have a 3-star gourmet Michelin meal, okay?
Right.
You eat to live, but variety is important.
Imagine a set of astronauts going to Mars and the food is waiting for them. I think we'll necessarily have to sterilize that food, right? Like either like boil it or cook it so that it is sterile and it doesn't go bad. But that's just not how we eat on Earth. When we eat food, we actually consume microbes from our environment. So that's one of the things I'm like would be most worried about, that people are going to get there. The food's not going to be bad because somebody's properly sterilized it. But then they're going to get there and have this huge missing component when they eat, which is the microbes around us, right? You've heard of the microbiome inside of us. We have this like wonderful universe of microorganisms. I'd be worried about people going to Mars and having everything be too sterile. Right. And we have this huge missing component, and we simply don't know what would happen.
We are not meant to necessarily eat food processed in that way for that long of a time. And there is also evidence an inappropriate diet may increase your risk of a variety of different conditions. We know a good diet is important for protecting ourselves against coming against some of these risks. It has to be important for our considerations for astronauts that are going to be going into deep space without resupply, without access to fresh vegetables. And so the question is, how do we fix it?
One of the things that I think is going to be a benefit is growing crops on the vehicle on the way. How are we going to grow plants in space? So they package the seeds, they figure out how to plant them and in what kind of media, how do you water them and all of that.
When they got to grow things, it was a real psychological boost to watch these plants grow, and they became part of the family, and people would go and look at the plants grow. So it's not just for eating, but it's also for the for cultural and for behavioral health purposes, to have fresh foods aboard. And some of the nutrients that you get from fresh foods, you're not going to be able to probably maintain for very long periods of time.
So the Advanced Plant Habitat is one of 2 systems on the International Space Station that is designed to grow plants in space.
Okay, and so if you had like the full thing, would it be filled with tomato plants or other types of plants?
For us, we are going to be testing how our tomato plants grow in microgravity. This is called a quadrant. We send it up with just the seeds in here, and then the astronauts plug it into the system. It waters it, and then the seeds germinate, and the plants grow. And so the goal of our experiment is to grow the tomato plants until they produce tomato fruit, and then have the astronauts harvest the seeds and then replant them and then do the next round.
Often plants are dependent
on the microbiome.
We know that from regions where seeds are grown in soil that's, accommodating for them. But growing plants is risky.
These tomato plants, we call them space tomatoes, and that stands for small plants for agriculture in confined environments.
Love it.
We have engineered these plants to be smaller than a normal tomato plant. So they're a cherry variety of tomatoes, so they're already somewhat small and they produce small fruit. But what we've done is gone in and done genome editing in order to knock out key genes involved in the stress response of the plants. So they think that they are stressed, so then the plants decide to flower and fruit as fast as they can. Right here, all the flowers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it has the potential to produce between 10 to 15, maybe maximum 20.
We're moving towards a future where it's a self-sustaining system. You eat, you harvest, you replant, you keep growing. That sustainability is an interesting concept.
You're intrinsically relying on a crop to meet not only a caloric need, but a micronutrient need, and that crop fails.
Yeah, you're kind
It's
of
devastating.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so for a while we need to learn that in a safe place like low Earth orbit, lunar orbit, lunar surface to work through the troubleshooting, to make the failures that allow us to make the big gains.
Have you tasted one of these?
I have tasted them.
And?
They taste great.
They taste great.
So we've done a taste test, and we found that making the plant smaller does not affect the taste.
Okay.
And more importantly, even, we've checked the nutrients, and also they have the same level of nutrients as a normal tomato too. So we don't want to sacrifice the benefits of eating a fresh fruit or vegetable by just making the plant smaller. So that's something we're always evaluating as well.
Right.
I mean, I see it extending beyond what some of these gastrochemistry chefs are doing down here on Earth now, where you go into these restaurants and there's smells being piped in, there's colors that change in the room, so that when this plate arrives that's like the size of a little saucer and it's got this foamy thing and this little piece of a chip of something and whatever, and that's your whole meal that you just probably paid more for than you would at any restaurant you've ever gone to. And then you eat it, and it's the most delicious thing you've ever experienced. And you don't know why, because normally you have a plate that's this big and it's got, you know, if you eat meat, it's got the meat and the potato and the vegetable and the dessert on the side and all of these things that we try now on the space station to accommodate in those little silver pouches.
Right now, in order for the food system to be safe, it's a pretty...
We've got a ways to go.
We've got a ways to go. It is safe. It may not be very tasty, so that, you know, it struggle with palatability. You know, the variety is limited, and really, it doesn't even last the time that we need it to last. We know that.
Roughly 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years, and it has to be prepared in advance of that.
Can we understand these microbial communities? Can we understand how they're influenced by food? Can we optimize diets to make where you have the highest probability of influencing those functions that we think matter for the health of astronauts, and also what would matter for us here at Earth? And when we think about major risks that astronauts may be facing in Mars, not necessarily the moon, but we're really talking 3 years where you're sent in one direction, you don't come back. What can we protect them against? Mental health will be an issue. Radiation damage will be an issue. We hope GI distress won't be an issue. Yeah. But these are all the things that we need to prepare for, because once they're gone, it can't be fixed. And I think the perfect scenario in the future is if we cannot provide a therapeutic intervention, where we can provide resilience. And if we can understand those microbes that are driving those functions that maybe can protect somebody from having an adverse stress response, protect somebody from having a strong immune response to whatever stimulant it may be, even some of the foods on that spacecraft.
Right.
And or protect against the radiation damage that they'll inevitably be exposed to. That's the best way to reduce that flight risk.
The current food system used by the space program works, but to keep humans healthy on the moon and eventually on Mars, a revolutionary new way to maintain, supply, and provide the proper nutrients for people has to be developed.
Mental toughness is more important than physical toughness and conditioning, and team cohesion is just critical, because look, you do feel differently the moment you get on orbit. It's instantaneous. You're not, the same person. That doesn't mean you can't function and be happy and have good morale, but you are different. You're feeling different. And it stays like that for, well, at least it did for the 3 days I was on orbit.
So talk to me a little bit about the psychological evaluations ahead of time and how you got to apply some of those lessons learned in training for being a good crewmate.
One of the things that I think is fascinating about being a crew in space, I mean, it really is a microcosm of being the crew of Spaceship Earth, where we have the luxury of knowing that up there we are, in my case, 6 people, and we have a mission to accomplish, and which is, pushing the edge of exploration and figuring out how are we going to live up there, and what lessons can we learn there that we can then apply other places. One of my mechanisms for realizing, like I'm talking and somebody isn't understanding me, on my crew for whatever reason. I mean, it could be that because they didn't work with a lot of women before. It could be that we come from different countries. It could be that we have just way different styles. And interestingly enough, in some of the survival exercises that we did, I think that it wasn't just, did you build a shelter, all those things, did you carry out your injured crewmate? It was how were you as a crew when unexpected things happened?
You not only have to get along with each other during the space flight, you also have to bond as a crew early on, and you have to go through innumerable hours of training together. If you don't get along before the flight, you're not going to get along during the flight. It's kind of like, knowing someone before you get married. If you don't get along before that time, you're probably not going to get along after you get married.
I heard you talk at one of the previous interviews about that we've had before when we had the Far From Alone event. Do you remember we talked about?
Of course, yeah.
The things that you did with your son to stay connected, because astronauts do have to be apart from their families. How did you stay connected when you were on station?
One of the things that we did, even starting during the training, which happens for in my case, for 3 years ahead of the mission. So my son was 7 when I started training, and reading stories was, I think that what that really means when you're home is even, let's spend this time together. And we, read a story that we're interested in, but we get to have time together. And so I would actually rip these books in half so I wouldn't have to carry a big book around. And read to him while I was in all these different countries training. And then that's what I did up on the space station. And, it's neat to have your mom up on the space station, but really you have a regular everyday old life. And, hi, how was your day? How was your day? I mean, that gets really old when you're 10.
On a mission to Mars, we'll be encountering up to 40 minutes of time delay communication. Say that you are on Mars, on the surface of Mars or around the planet, and you have a medical emergency, right? You grab the phone, and then if you want to ask a question to the physician down here in Houston, it's going to take 20 minutes for that signal to come back to Earth. And then if they want to respond to you or they want to tell you what to do, it's going to take another 20 minutes. If you have a medical emergency that takes 2 or 3 minutes to make a decision and to start a treatment, of course you cannot rely on telemedicine like this, right? So all of these capabilities are now being explored and being developed. So during this mission, we were able to simulate how these facing time delay communications evolve as you are going further in the mission, 5, 10, 20 minutes until the full 40 minutes. And really, it has impacts in everything that you do, right? Like even communicating to your family, right? You just cannot communicate to your family in real time. So it's one of the most challenging things.
For most people, they've actually been preparing for this time in Antarctica longer than they'll actually be in Antarctica. So for some of them, it's actually been years and years of developing skills, of, setting their affairs in order so that they can essentially be completely disconnected from the rest of the world for up to around 12 months or so.
The area that I continue to worry the most about with spaceflight participants came up during this study, and that was anxiety. It was very difficult to predict who was going to have anxiety based on their pre-screening. They did not come up with a good method to pre-screen for anxiety, and they had around 15 or so that either before they did the centrifuge or after the first run or so say, not for me.
Did you ever talk to your family members about their feelings when you were gone?
It's a hard conversation to have. You almost dread that as much as the launch, is that conversation you need to have with your kids that I think it's going to be all right, but there's a real danger here. And it's not something that's pleasant to talk about when you're talking about someone that you love, and it's difficult to say goodbye. I think that anyone that says that they don't have fear when they go out to the launch pad is either not telling the truth or there's something wrong with them mentally. I think all of us had educated fear educated in the sense that we trained and we tried to overcome the fear, but we knew that there was danger there.
And things also can go wrong, and you're a lot farther away from help and the comforts of 1G. So I think that, being in the right frame of mind, being able to persevere through, uncomfortable, I'd say would be situations, and still be happy and productive is just paramount, especially, when you're not, hours away from coming home, but, potentially months away from coming home.
Look, if sitting on top of 4.5 million pounds of high explosive causes you undue emotional stress, maybe you're in the wrong profession.
I'm not a great psychiatrist, but for me, having a great psychiatrist give me where their vulnerabilities are, where their strengths are, what to look out for, has been critical for spaceflight participants. Not quite as important for astronauts, where they're screened before they come, and they've all been in hazardous environments for years. I always feel more comfortable if a spaceflight participant's flown in jets, or as a pilot, or as a parachutist, or has been to Antarctica, or gone down the Amazon River. But sometimes they're a singer.
One very important thing I learned about while living in space is that all the preparation you can do, there are some things you can never prepare for, and you have to have solid fundamentals, but you also have to learn there's a better and more effective way to adapt, and there's a way to adapt or do things on the fly that's unprepared and not going to be very good for you. So knowing everything you can about the environment, but also respecting the environment enough to know I've never spent exposed time in 1/3 gravity. So when I get there, I'm going to have to adapt what I do and how I use my equipment.
So let me get this straight. Bacteria that live in my gut, on my skin, all over my body are controlling, or have the potential of controlling, my mood, my pain levels.
Potential is a good word to say. Yeah, and so the field is still there trying to understand this. And ultimately we'll need to be able to test it within people. But if you step back and ask, who am I? What am I? We're both just big bags of protein-protein interactions in biochemistry. And so the pain we feel is a chemical reaction or a response to a stimuli. The behaviors we feel, these are also chemical interactions and different proteins clashing. And so if you have microbes on and in you that are just smaller bags of protein-protein interactions and smaller bags of biochemistry, they too can influence those pathways. And these pathways could be relevant for anything that we care about. And when we think about brain health, it's not just mood. There's also evidence for certain disorders associated with neuroinflammation, as well as things like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. And so if we can really understand how these microbes that are effectively part of us influence these pathways, and perhaps the reason we have these diseases in the first place, and those pathways are disrupted in the first place, is because of these microbes, then we can be rational and try to fix them.
I tell a story often about one crew member who loved Snickers bars, right? And so he had sent up to him multiple Snickers bars, and he spaced them out over the course of his mission. And that was a positive countermeasure because he looked forward to that. He knew when he was going to open that Snickers bar, and it really helped him and it drove him.
We happened to be up during Hanukkah. I wasn't planning to make a big deal about it. I mean, this was just a private thing that I was doing. But after we had finished all the work on Hubble, we had about a half a day of free time. So I took out the dreidel and I was just sort of spinning it for fun. What I didn't realize was that the camera in the mid-deck was live, and all those images were going down to Earth. And like I said, I hadn't planned to say anything about it, but next thing I knew, the voice from the Capcom, Susan Helms, came up and said, "Hey, Jeff, I'll bet all of America would like to know what you're doing up there, and what's that thing that you have?" So I thought to myself, well, all right, I wasn't planning to say anything, but they asked, so here goes. And I gave a big spiel about Hanukkah and the Festival of Lights, because I also had a little menorah, Hanukkah. Couldn't light the candles, of course, but so I explained that, and then it got picked up by a television station, and now, I mean, it's on the internet. You can go look up dreidels in space and see me spinning the little dreidel.
Talk about the lighting a little bit.
Well, the lighting was, the breakthrough there is knowing it's just not about darkness and light, it's also about the different frequencies of light. They said when they came out with LED lights, of course we wanted to use LED lights. It's much less power, but you have a big blue spike, so we know the blue frequency and green frequencies are very alerting. They actually hit the back of your retina they suppress melatonin and make melanopsin, which is sort of the yin and yang of melatonin. And so if you can control the normal day-night cycle in the module, then you give them a normal day-night cycle.
Some of the NASA flight docs actually use light and blue light to be able to slam shift themselves when they were
Talk
going,
about slam
to
shifting.
Russian.
What is that?
This is an activity that takes place. It's used in the space environment where you're on a particular night-day cycle. In space, of course, you have a sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes. So you have 16, full cycles in a 24-hour day. Because of various launches and rendezvous that take place, you might have to perform a critical task what might be the middle of your night, in which case
Artificially induced.
Exactly.
Night.
So
Mhm.
right, exactly. So what you have to do is then change your circadian rhythm in a very sudden way, and this can be very difficult for some individuals, and we're concerned because we don't want to have a decrement in human performance or a human failure at a time when there's, when you're tired.
What I found really remarkable about the work with the lights and the photoreceptors is that vision isn't required. So even blind individuals who don't have the vision capability are still entrained. Their retinas are still entrained by these signals from light. And so it's a primordial, like you said, a very basic phenomena of our circadian clock in our bodies. And every organ in the body actually can sense the circadian rhythm. So, you're metabolizing when you're sleeping according to a sleep cycle. It's phenomenal. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about sleep with various people because we know how important that is for behavioral health.
Well, humor is a really important thing. I've been on cruise where there wasn't enough of it, and I've been on cruise where we just want to tell the guy to shut up because he was telling jokes when the countdown was at 10, and he was still down there in the middeck telling jokes, and so humor at the right point is really helpful. I tend to be one that likes more humor than less. I think that if you get totally serious about something, you can't be a little bit lighthearted about it. It's difficult to deal with danger even, I think, if you don't have a kind of a lighthearted look at it. And I think we had maybe what you call a gallows type humor that we might have in the military. A saying might be, well, if you don't come back from this mission, can I have your stereo? Something like that. And it's just a way of coping with difficult situations. And so I think humor is extremely important.
Humor.
Yeah, humor. And I'll tell you, I show a picture in my presentations it's a crew picture from Expedition 21. And there's 9 of us on board because 3 crew members have come up before 3 went down. And so we got 9 people on board. One of those people is Guy Laliberté, who is the owner, founder of Cirque du Soleil. He traveled as a spaceflight participant. He was there for 10 days with us. So we're all in our blue, kind of fancy flight suits, and we're all floating in different directions, heads all coming together, some coming up down. And we're, flashing the peace sign, and we've got clown noses on. Because Guy considers himself a clown, and he brought them with him for all of us to have. It's one of my very favorite pictures from space, because I think it shows that total mix of what you want to have in the best kind of cruise.
Have you made any observations, things that you look for that would be advantageous for somebody who's going to be an expeditioner versus somebody you would say, yeah, you probably wouldn't do well?
So the first thing is, do they want to be there? Because that motivation is very, very important for adaptation. But the other things that we do find really, really helpful, particularly, are things like cognitive flexibility. And essentially what I mean by that is an ability to think flexibly, to adapt to change, to accept the things that are out of your control and problem solve those things that are in your control. If you like to coin the phrase, don't sweat the small stuff. It seems very easy. But remember, all the normal distractions, all the normal coping strategies that you would have in the normal environment, in the normal world, aren't there. So what can happen is that everyday frustrations, everyday challenges become much more difficult to navigate because you can't escape them.
We're working on artificial intelligence and having sort of that robot butler kind of a thing, someone that you can talk to that then responds to you. It's not just, a one-way discussion. They actually get a response. Very science fiction-y, right? Kind of Hal, but not Hal.
A benevolent Hal.
Actually, yes. No one was gonna, not open the hatch for you or anything, but just something that you can interact with. It's not, a dumb machine, which we hear described often. That artificial intelligence is going to be very important.
The thing I miss the most is dinners around the table, either on the Russian segment or in the U.S. segment, when we would have a dinner with the entire crew and just sharing food, laughing, singing songs, making funny videos, just telling jokes, talking about TV shows the same things that we would do if we were on Earth. But also because it was the pandemic on Earth, we were all so longing for that. We launched in November of 2020. And so there weren't vaccines yet. We were still masked and distanced. And so to get to ISS, everyone being healthy and being able to actually be together physically was just so great and so welcome. And that is a huge part of the mental well-being that you get on station.
The table in the space station, it's in the middle of the space station in Node 1. And it's this table that, is sitting just like a table would anywhere on Earth, right? And everybody literally has, bruises on, one hip going to the Russian segment from the US, and bruises on the other hip from coming back because it's right in the way. And then you knock people's spoons and stuff that they have perched there. And as soon as Expedition 26 left, the hatch closed, they were safely on their way. And Paolo undid that table and put it at an angle so that it basically if you put it flat against the wall, nobody's going to hurt themselves on it, right? But then we don't have a place to gather, and we need to be able to be together.
There's a lot of language that goes along with the Antarctic experience, a very Antarctic language. And I imagine
there's a dialect. There's a whole dialect.
There is. And the interesting thing is it changes from station to station as well. And in one of the most extreme examples of this, and this happened some time ago now, there was a station who learned to communicate in clicks and ticks. Absolutely incredible.
Indigenous tribes, indigenous people who use that, right?
That's right. And that really, I think, further helps people to understand that you are so removed from everyday life that you can actually develop your own language.
The point is, I think that astronauts are people. We're not robots. We have our culture. We take our culture with us. And some things we can do like we do on Earth, and some things we can't.
Long duration stays on the moon and eventually on Mars will absolutely challenge the mental resilience of humans in extraordinary ways.
People don't think about the fact that we're built for the Earth. We're like a little spacecraft that's built for the Earth, right? And so, it's only by us going to these different places that we're really able to understand, how does that spacecraft operate differently? And guess what? Every single human out there is a little bit different spacecraft.
Actually, one of the biggest issues that we have is the lack of diversity, right? And the very small sample size that we have.
You're talking about
the number of people that have flown to space so far.
Over
the entire 60 years of human spaceflight. Yeah.
The U.S. program,
roughly 520 people.
Mostly men.
Mostly Americans and Russians.
Mostly Americans, yeah.
Very little Asians and African Americans and other populations that are as relevant.
No Mexicans like you?
Actually, one.
One Mexican.
One Mexican, yeah.
The NASA astronauts come in very clean, but they don't fly the first day they get there. And
When you say by clean, what do you mean by that?
medical
clean, like
decrements.
pristine.
Yes, but that doesn't stay that way, and you've invested millions in them, and so if that risk that they develop can be mitigated, they can fly. And everyone's familiar with Alan Shepard's Meniere's disease or Deke Slayton's atrial fibrillation. We've had about 5 with atrial fibrillation that have flown, and we've had astronauts with strokes that have a reason for the stroke, it's fixed, and they don't have any deficits, and they've flown. And there's many other conditions that they have conditions, but not near the level that you see in commercial spaceflight participants. And the age range is so much different. When we did these studies in the centrifuge, UTMB did it in Philadelphia, on individuals, they went from 19 to 89 in age range.
An age range.
And
89.
So a wide difference in ages.
Humans are incredibly variable. We all see the ads on TV, right? That we have pharmaceutical ads all the time now, and they talk about, in clinical trials. Well, for those clinical trials, we're talking tens of thousands of people to get the statistics necessary to be able to say, yes, this medication is better than that medication. It's efficacious. It's safe. We don't have that luxury. If we're lucky, we get 10 or 12 astronauts in an experiment.
I'm really a big believer, particularly when you're dealing with such a small cadre of people, that you're giving the keys to a $100 billion facility, that I'd like to know their genomics. I'd like to know.
Give me a high five on that.
I'd like to know if they have a thrombophilia.
Yes, we need to know that.
Before they fly, because that comes into play with whether you use birth control pills in someone or not. If they have a thrombophilia, but it must be on birth control pills. But you can do those with just thrombophilia screen. But we should know their genomics and what they're at risk for. If they happen to have a clot, for example, are these the people that will have trouble handling the medications, or we need a change of dose for the medication? There is an increased risk of clotting, but there's the chance of dying from a clot still extremely remote.
Thanks to the COVID pandemic, I think we've all, as a species, have been introduced to the immune system in a really fundamental way. And that is, we know that it's right in the middle of a lot of life processes. So this richness of the immune system as a memory of what we should expect or not expect. It's your best friend, to keep your body constantly moving in a healthy direction. The immune system, for a lot of the space program, I think there's been a war with, kind of like, well, there's all this inflammation, and it's so stressful being, and so it is stressful being in space, right? We should have much more fundamental knowledge about how to stop the inflammation after it starts, not beat it over the head with a hammer. Like, don't let it start. So a lot of the drugs that people take here, right, are anti-inflammatory drugs. They're there to just take a sledgehammer and say, never have an inflammation response. My argument is, this inflammation response is a healthy response to an unnatural environment, right? And so we really need to spend a little more time understanding how to help the immune system along during the journey.
So have you been kind of keeping up with the SANS condition? I know it's changed names. It used to be VIP.
I know they keep changing it. It's now a spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome.
Yes, SANS.
Yeah, there's not many. NASA loves their acronyms. Some of the astronauts who had stated to me that they didn't need to wear their contact lenses when they got to orbit, that their vision was fine. It normalized. I thought, well, that's bloody strange. And then I talked to some of the ophthalmologists, and they said, yeah, some of these guys come back with a little bit of papilledema, and that was it. But no astronaut would ever admit that they had a change of vision.
We have a number of neurologists who've been former NASA and in some cases Navy flight surgeons, and they were the ones who were contacted when an astronaut came back with optic nerve swelling.
By the way, the optic nerve is not an optic nerve. It's actually a tract of the brain, and it's surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid. So
it is part of the brain. That's the thing that I think most people don't understand.
It's not a nerve.
Your eye is part of your brain, and that's why through looking at the eye, we can actually understand what's going on with your brain.
Yeah.
Really important.
So what you see is that this optic nerve, under pressure, the sheath around it, it behaves like a taut hose, like you see the fire department with the taut hose. It bends and kinks, and that's what we saw.
And of course, we really have to look at countermeasures and ways of reducing this risk, because some believe that this is the #1 risk to astronaut health in low Earth orbit.
Tell me what you think has been the progress that's been made, at least in sensory motor research, as you've seen it from a deep perspective of knowing the field.
It's affected by a whole bunch of different things, right? The most obvious thing is gravity. We have evolved in a gravitational environment. We have sensors in our inner ears, we have sensors on our butts, we have sensors on our feet, we have sensors on our arms that tell us where down is all the time, right? And when that disappears, then it confuses the brain.
We know the first system that is the most significant
vestibular
is the vestibular. And that controls how well you can stand up and ambulate and negotiate, walking and
they figure it out
translating
fairly quickly.
Yeah, and that's one where exposure and stimuli is important.
The question is 1/3 or 1/6 gravity enough to stimulate their balance organs to facilitate that recovery?
So they can do that and recover in 1G.
Because the forcing function of 1G from 0G is probably quite profound.
Because the delay that happens, or the lack of recovery, if you just immobilize yourself and don't do anything.
Right.
But you run the risk of overstimulating and then getting very sick and having a big setback. So it's one of those we're trying to learn what is the right prescription of show it and take it away.
Eventually you adapt to that. We're very plastic systems that are adaptive, and you can adapt to that. But during that adaptation time frame, things like spatial orientation, which way is up, get confusing, how to locomote. In 0G, you don't have to worry much about that. You're pushing off things. Although at the beginning, people push a little too hard and they push themselves quickly across the vehicle. But then after the transition coming back, if they're in space long enough to adapt to the 0G environment, then they have to relearn how to do things on Earth.
They always flew a treadmill. Sometimes they flew a bicycle ergometer. I have to say, I'm not generally a runner. I like to ride a bike, I roller skate. Now, to run on a treadmill when you're weightless, you have to put on a harness with bungee cords to pull yourself down so that you have some, basically a force on you. Otherwise, you can't really run on the treadmill. So I got on and I ran for about 15, 20 minutes. And then I stopped. And when I released the bungee cord and I floated back up, and I realized, all that time I was running on the treadmill, I felt like I was back on Earth. The hell with this? I don't need that. I'm going to spend the rest of my life back on Earth. And that's the last time I ever exercised in space. But remember, I was on the shuttle, and the longest I was ever up was about 2.5 weeks. You can go 2.5 weeks without exercising, but no question, up in the space station, 6 months, yeah, you got to exercise or your muscles are going to turn to jelly or just disappear, and your bones are going to lose calcium. And so exercise really is important.
Our capability for medical support is really fairly limited. There may be an event where we just can't treat.
But there comes a time when you have to triage, is further care of this person using up all of these supplies in the best interest of the entire crew?
Of the rest of the mission and the rest of the crew.
Those are really tough decisions.
Dave, you just got a new shoulder put in.
I did, and it is already feeling a lot better. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what would happen to an astronaut if you had something like this occurring in space where you couldn't use your shoulder, you had extreme pain. How would you even deal with a situation like that?
You might not even need a sling, because your natural position in space is kind of the position that you want to be in with a sling. There wouldn't be gravity that's putting pressure on your shoulder, for example. And also, you don't need to have as much strength to do certain tasks as you would here on Earth. You're not working against gravity. So let's say that you fracture your wrist. You still have another arm that you can work with. You probably just put a splint on, and you wouldn't have gravity causing you more pain, and you might do much better than you would think.
Here in our lab, we've actually looking at ways we could create a splint to immobilize
someone's injury, like a wrist or an ankle, some extremity, right? And the idea is, would a fracture like that occur in space? More than likely, we'll see. But if it does happen, one thing that we can do is try to create that splint. So instead of having a assembled splint or the materials that you use for splinting in a medical kit and just kind of taking up space, waiting for the opportunity to be used, because the hope is you never have to. Like from a medical perspective, you hope you never have to use any of the equipment you take with us.
Right.
So it's a weird trade-off, because when you hope you never have to use it, but when you do need to use it, it needs to be there.
Right.
So it's kind of an odd situation with medicine is that kind of weird trade.
So the medical kit will be really limited.
I
Like
think
we
so.
can't bring a lot of stuff with us.
Well, that's ready to go. And so this is
Right.
where the beauty of 3D printing comes in, is before I create the splint, for example, it's a digital file. It's on a computer. It takes no space because it's an electron.
Okay.
And so that's what we're basically doing, is can we digitize our medical hardware and then recreate it as we need it?
What does Level X do? We advance the practice of medicine through play. We make games for doctors. What does that, people raise an eyebrow. What does that mean, games for doctors, right? What if we actually put together a team of top video game designers, artists, engineers from across the industry, team them up with, hundreds of physician advisors across every major specialty, and actually put them on the challenge of capturing the practice of medicine and the challenges of the practice of medicine as video games? You could actually have really broad impact, right? Through the combination of there's huge demand for this, and there's an opportunity to really affect outcomes.
When you told me you could turn off gravity, I just oh my gosh, we have to work together.
Gravity is already an input to these simulations. All we have to do for microgravity is just set that number to 0.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden what starts happening is the fluids will start behaving like it's 0 gravity.
And we see that in astronauts, as you know.
Exactly. And as long as we've got the simulation right in terms of things like cohesion and surface tension and things like that, it will behave. Those fluids will now form globs and float in midair,
Just like
they
you would in 0 gravity.
Exactly.
And the beauty of that is that you could set it to a 6th gravity on the moon. You could set it to roughly 3rd gravity for Mars. And so we can actually practice procedures on Moon, Mars, 0, anywhere we want to go.
Exactly. And you can simulate exactly what would happen.
We've been doing a lot of, team dynamic research and behavioral research. If you talk about the things that keep us up at night, that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. Now, we're working on a lot of different countermeasures, just-in-time training, so that the crew doesn't have to know, and they can't know everything before they go. There's going to have to be a mechanism for them to do things on the fly, if you will. So they'll have this large library of digital instruction manual, all these different things.
By now we have over 750,000 medical professionals playing the games. We're working with dozens of leading life science companies, medical device companies, medical societies, Trish, NASA. And so now, so now I think we've come to the other side, and there's a realization of sort of the value and application of game technology and design to advance the practice of medicine. Anything that a medical professional does, a procedure is the classic example, right? On a new procedure, a new device, a new technique, the first 100 patients that you treat, in some case the first 500, the outcomes aren't nearly as good as the hundreds that come after that, right? And it's simply because the only way to learn and develop that mental model and modify your neural network, right, to be able to do the procedure at the same quality that you were able to use the old one, right, is through practice. And sometimes it's the reason you need 100 or 200 patients isn't because you need to practice 100 or 200 times, but you need to have that many patients under your belt in order to experience enough of the 1 to 2% rare, difficult, complex cases, right, that are where the real learning happens.
Yep.
And so the opportunity is with this technology, on your phone or in a VR headset, what we can do is we can sit you down and over a course of an hour, play through 30, 50 of the rarest, most difficult cases that it would take 5 lifetimes to encounter. And so as I said, we have over 750,000 medical professionals playing these games on mobile. They're filled with dozens of rare, difficult cases that have been submitted by doctors and surgeons all across the country. And so here I'm just, playing this here on my phone. But this is not a video. This is a totally interactive virtual patient. What do I mean by that? Well, first off, this patient is squishy. The tissue moves. And so here, this is a routine polypectomy, right? So I need to find all the precancerous polyps that might hide behind folds. Here I can, push them down to try to find, the polyps that hide. Here I've got one that's out in the open, so I'll come and grab it, right? I think this is a hidden object game. I've been playing a bunch of levels where I need to find the hidden polyps. So I'll go and remove it. What I don't realize is this is a rare scenario where the polyp embeds on a blood vessel. So now I've triggered a bleed 1 meter inside the body.
There are a whole host of different disease states that the first few symptoms that show up are actually visible in your eye movements. Imperceptible to you. You have no idea before the classic symptoms appear. And frankly, the neurologist doesn't know either. Basically, we're saying we want to use this to develop physiological biomarkers of a whole host of different disease states that can be monitored continuously as someone is just interacting with each other or the internet.
The visual system is so complicated, it touches on so many different regions of the brain that when there's an impairment, it may not be visible at all to the test that your doctor is going to do on you.
Yeah, very crude.
Yeah, but it will show up and in a test that is looking at the close-up of your eyeballs, doing this very precise, very well-calibrated task. And not only can we look at, okay, there has been a deviation, but based on the nature of that deviation, we can say, okay, this or that region of the brain is what's been compromised.
You can map it. You can map where that, God forbid, I had a bleed or, something going on. You're right, you can map it.
Ultrasound is very flammable because it's not heavy, it's not taking a lot of power, it's easy to operate. And finally, we have experience flying it. We've flown 8 ultrasound devices over the years, before even the space station
8
started. That's correct.
Okay. And no radiation emitted by it, as opposed to?
Absolutely safe, repeatable, transmittable. So the modality just, it sometimes feels it's been created just to fly in space.
It's been created for space. So
Exactly.
how does the physics work? I mean, how is ultrasound, so it's sound waves, how is it generated by a traditional system? How are those sound waves work to show you an image? And I know that they could get kind of complicated here and very techy, but just for the lay audience, how does it work, and how is this new device that we're working with, the Butterfly ultrasound, different than the traditional ultrasounds?
So your traditional ultrasound devices have a piezoelectric crystal that forms the transducer of the ultrasound machine, the ultrasound head, and they typically have like 128 elements on average for a lot of the different probes. So they're fairly limited, and they have a very fixed shape. So you have the curved probes, the linear probes, and they're tuned for different frequencies. So they have different depth capabilities. You can either scan something that's shallow or something that's deep. What's unique about this technology that Butterfly has come up with or has developed and commercialized is it's all ultrasound on a chip. So they have micro transducers on a chip. There are 9,000 elements on the face of this
This is the
probe.
same chip that would go into what kind of devices today?
It's unique. It's designed specifically to produce and receive ultrasound.
But an equivalent of what would go into your smartphone, your smartwatch?
Essentially, yeah.
Very small.
It's a silicon chip. Well, it covers the face of the probe. All the elements are on the probe, but there are 9,000 elements as opposed to a couple hundred that might be on a typical probe. So, and they're all individually tunable. So, because of that, they can produce a linear probe that scans at very shallow depths, or a cardiac probe that scans at very deep depths, or you can have a curved probe for like an abdominal type probe that you would have. They can do all of that with a single probe.
We're looking at devices that can take on at least the medical portion of that function, the standby medical capability portion, into a much smaller size. Something like this that hooks up.
This takes the place of an entire cart of the machine and multiple probes.
Yes, and again, I want to repeat that it's about medical
grade,
acute medical scenarios rather than comprehensive research applications.
Talk through the protocols. This is an astronaut that is not a trained ultrasound technician,
right?
is not a physician. And how much training? Was there any training?
None.
None whatsoever.
So that's
here you go.
Yeah, this is unique. We're moving into a different realm of doing not remote guidance of medical care.
Yeah.
You know, we have really gotten very reliant on remote guidance and experts on the ground, like Ashot, who literally walk the crew members through every step of every procedure
Right.
if they're doing something, because we have real-time communications. You know, when we start doing Artemis missions, you know, the latency gets a little bit longer. It gets a little bit more frustrating, still very manageable. As we start moving towards Mars, you know, you're up to 20-minute one-way delay, and that's just not possible. So, you know, we need to start looking at ways to get our crew members to be able to do these scans on their own. So that we're not only looking at the technology application, because it's very exciting for what it can do in such a small package. I mean, obviously, we like to refer to it as being completely capability enabling, because we simply will not have the mass volume on these smaller vehicles to fly large ultrasound machines. So this type of device is literally the only thing that we can take with us. So this enables that capability within our medical systems.
So it works off a smartphone. It's just a simple plug, just like you would a charger.
Yeah, a regular iPhone.
Or
Yeah.
Android. There are Android cables.
Android capable, yeah.
You plug it in, and it blinks a couple of times, asks for permission to connect, and it's ready to go. There we go. I'm going to turn on the color mode. There it is.
One of the devices that we have been supporting for the last few years, this is a proof of concept device. This is 3D printed.
3D printed.
So this is very easy to use. First, you would get a single drop of blood. Then you would put that blood here.
Just in there.
In there,
Okay.
yeah. Then you have to wait until there's a reaction. This usually takes roughly 15 to 25 minutes. Going back to the training of the astronauts, of course, they're not full lab technicians, right, that are used to measuring these things all the time. So this is when we can use a cell phone. The cell phone has an app already there, and it can quantify the colorimetric changes.
With
and
the
it can
camera?
with the camera.
You would
There's
attach it?
there's a plastic attachment that you can use. Put this here.
So I've got basically this software that would analyze
Yes, it's just
the
an
data.
app that you download. It analyzes the data and it tells you your concentration of, say, immunoglobulins or whatever you're measuring is within this and this range.
We've also been working on what we call microbial devices. And this is kind of falls in the family of therapeutic devices. And so our lab with Bob Langer, as well as Giovanni Traverso, they've actually developed what is called a gastric resident device. So basically, this is a pill that you can take. It goes inside you, and frankly, I love to think about it as like this tiny little spaceship that goes inside your gut. It like goes in and it deploys, similar to the way you would imagine that a satellite is sent up to space and then it has to deploy its little wings. And so, in the same way, we have these pills that go inside us. They're essentially like pieces of plastic. They're not that foreign or anything. They open up, and so what allows them to do is they get kind of stuck in your stomach. And they stay there for an extended period of time. And, you know, we're looking to the time scales of beyond a week up to multiple months, and in some cases, maybe even a year. And so these little kind of like star pills that we've made allow people to remember that one time, take them, and then the little device in their stomach takes care of sort of diffusing out the drugs on the correct schedule.
On that mission to Mars, there may be a medical scenario which we cannot address.
We're going to lose crews. There's no question going to Mars, we're going to lose crews. We're going to lose crew members, we're going to lose crews.
The real question is not the ethics of not treating a condition, is asking the crew to treat a futile outcome, or asking the crew to autonomously decide with no support, because they're 40 minutes away from Earth by light, by the speed of light, to decide not to treat a medical condition. Right? And that is the challenge. We rapidly evacuate people from places because we call this scoop and run. We don't have the resources to take care of this person where we're at. We're going to scoop them up, kind of stabilize them if we can, and get them to where we can take care of them. Right? This is used in most modern nations, why we have ambulances. We have this sort of scoop and run mentality because we can't stand and fight. We can't treat all these serious illnesses on orbit. The mass power volume of actually designing a system is prohibitive in low Earth orbit.
Are we thinking about palliative care?
NASA has a plan already that what you would do if someone dies in space, which will happen eventually. And you'll have to do, based on their culture and their religion and their family wishes, what you do will vary a little bit depending on all that and what's possible. Yeah, palliative care it's important on Earth and it'll be important in space.
Absolutely. With no medical support from Earth, future crews will be provided with the tools needed to contend with common ailments, as well as more serious concerns that arise because of the stressors of spaceflight.
So radiation is one of the highest level risks that we have, and because there is a fair amount of uncertainty. Space radiation is different from the radiation you get on the planet, and the reason is that we have this wonderful geomagnetosphere that surrounds us that protects us from a lot of the incoming radiation, whether it be from the sun or from GCR, galactic cosmic radiation, which are typically outburst from supernova and things, pulsars, quasars. So those pose a risk when you leave the Earth's geomagnetosphere that don't exist while you're here on the planet. And that's the radiation we're afraid of because we know it's higher energy and it has higher potential biologic effect than the radiation you would get, say, from getting a chest x-ray or a CT scan, or natural radiation like radon that you get in the household.
But GCR, from a biological standpoint, we're really trying to understand it. And it's dangerous. There's no doubt about it. And it's almost impossible to shield.
There's a whole world of new approaches to handling the effects of radiation. The problem with shielding is it's very good up to a certain level, but with these very high energy particles, the galactic cosmic rays, as they impact the shielding, they get slowed by it, but also they cause other particles to be emitted from the shield themselves. And above a certain thickness of shielding, new particles get created that have just as much potential effect on crew members as the old particles you're trying to shield.
They're looking at native pigments, so biologically oriented pigments that might be able to provide a certain layer of UV protection or ionizing radiation protection. Of course, we still have a big problem to solve with galactic cosmic rays and the really heavy radiation that's present. But thinking about these symbiotic systems that we could build with biology that might provide a certain level of radiation protection is a really interesting area to pursue. And we'd even had some interest from makeup companies thinking about the future of skin protection and could this be a new model of essentially sunblock for future astronauts that would be exposed in space.
Radiation protection countermeasures. That's the big problem. Protecting against solar flares. So we've got a number of folks we're working with on stem cell research, and I was at a meeting last month and just said basically, does everybody agree we should be banking our astronaut stem cells?
Oh heck yeah!
Heck yeah, bank them, and then take them with you, so that if you did get a solar flare, you could actually infuse your own stem cells.
On a cellular level, on a tissue and cellular level, what does it mean to have this kind of energy deposited there? And this is the kind that breaks DNA bonds. Mm-hmm. And we know when we talk about DNA damage,
we know where that leads.
Yeah, I mean, that's a dangerous proposition.
The stem cells in the small intestine in particular, but also the large intestine, are some of the fastest replicating cells within the body. So in the small intestine, the epithelium turns over every 3 to 5 days. In the large intestine, it's about every 6 to 8 days. So with such rapid turnover and regeneration of that epithelium, they're a particular target for effects of radiation. So radiation targets the DNA of replicating cells. It causes breaks in that DNA that then causes the cell not to undergo its normal cell replication, and it dies.
The cell itself can go down a route of cell death, which is actually pretty ideal. until it reaches critical mass in a tissue. So you're damaging tissue, you're losing viable cells.
Yeah, we want the damaged cells to die. We don't want them to replicate and create cancer.
Yeah, and that's the other part. Like the damage doesn't create a cell, it doesn't turn on the cell death pathway, but it actually inhibits the regulatory pathways that control the cell cycle, and it overpopulates, right? And that is the root of a solid tumor type cancer. So you have all these different not good routes it could go down.
What breakthrough cancer treatments, that's why it's so important, cancer treatments right here for Earth. What can we learn about genetics and specifically some of the hypotheses about mutation that change, and use that to our advantage? Use that to have the folks who are going to survive the most radiation hard, if you will, to space flight conditions. And that's where the genetics is going. It's just phenomenal. It's just fantastic. So yes, for our few Mars astronauts, but that's breakthrough science and thinking, of course, for Earth and the implications and ties to cancer and cancer research and cancer prevention are what keep, are most exciting for me.
Some of the early work that I did with Trish on stabilizing microbes against radiation and against just temperature and these kind of things that would degrade microorganisms. The idea there is that we would be able to travel with microbes, sort of like a backup crew of microorganisms that would be dried and stabilized.
Backup crew in the microbes. So you have the backup crew for the humans, and you have a backup crew for the microbes.
And that's what we're trying to do. We're basically trying to dry them, stabilize them, so we can basically have this sort of like a backup crew, just a miscellany of microbes, a store of microbes, where you can basically, as we get more advanced, we could, for example, measure what is the current status of the microbiome of the crew and their spaceship, and be like, oh, maybe we need to now add new ones, or some of them have been degraded, so we can, have these backups to be able to add to that and keep the microbiome diverse.
Radiation was probably the first of what we think of today as hazards that was identified and focused on by NASA research organizations. And that was more than 20 years ago. The main problem that they were looking at was cancer, development of cancer, which happens well after the mission, not during the mission, but well after the mission. They actually took a very conservative approach, and NASA's realizing maybe it was too conservative, and they're looking at what a reasonable exposure for crew members might be. Over all these years, we've spent a lot of time looking at cancer research associated with radiation. In the meantime, the real world has been going off and solving cancer one piece at a time and making huge headways in cancer. And that's actually part of the reason for having an institute like yours, is to help bring in what's going on in the real world and try to match what's going on with what's happening in NASA-funded research. And a lot of that is happening at the genetic level, personalized medicine, and trying to understand how that all ties together.
What is the agency doing to help these young women ensure that they won't have any issues later?
The big problem we've experienced is age. That by the time you get your PhD and you're successful, you do a postdoc and you come to NASA and you want to get to fly and your flight gets delayed and you finally get the flight. By the time you want to get pregnant, you're 41.
Yeah.
And that's a period of rapidly declining fertility.
Yeah.
And so NASA's gone out of their way to help young female astronauts by letting them cryopreserve ova or embryos when they're young. And the success rate of transferring those depends on the age at which they're collected and when they're frozen. And so that's great. We don't know about particulate radiation and what that's going to do, but this takes that out of the equation as well.
We need to spend a lot of time thinking about those tan bodies inside the spacecraft. Shielding and things work to a certain extent, but you mentioned kids, right? I'm 45. I've got, 1 adult children and 3 teenagers at home. But we have young astronauts who are still in their early family and development stages and that may want to have kids. We need to think so much more about that. We need to think about how we do that better on a ground-based sense and for a group of human space flyers in general. There's so many facets to that. In addition to sending some of those people to space before they are finished, growing their families.
We're going to be going to the moon. And the space radiation environment is a little bit different than from low Earth orbit. Where do you see are sort of the top priorities for you overseeing this program in terms of ensuring the health of our astronauts?
Well, I think what's great about these kinds of programs is you're getting the vast capability of the medical field and being able to interject us into solving our space health problems. It's that growth in the medical field that has actually reduced, in some ways, our radiation risk. One of the best things that I've been able to kind of follow through over this last year has been how the advances in cancer research have really allowed us to start downgrading that radiation risk in space.
We're starting to find some new issues with radiation exposure that could happen, that could cause changes during a mission, some changes in brain structure and other things that are giving us a little bit more concern about what might happen in a long duration mission and how we would recognize it and what we would do about it, either before the mission or during the mission. And that leads to a whole bunch of changing of paradigm, not only for the kinds of research that we carry out, but for how we prepare the crews for carrying out a mission when something like this could happen during the mission, and what would happen without having the expertise at the end of your loop because you're 15 light minutes away from Earth.
We genetically edited in a bunch of different factors so far, probably 20 or 25 that are known factors that promote the health of the stem cell. And we've gotten a couple hits that look like they promote stem cell growth in the cultures. So we're very excited to now test their efficacy in either preventing or therapeutically treating the damage that we're seeing from exposure to the proton beam.
Right, to radiation.
Yeah, and these are all being done with these organoid cultures that we're growing from the patient-derived stem cells.
The factors that you're genetically engineering these bacteria to make, they're normal factors. They're not strange, weird things. The body already makes them, but you're making them in a way that's over and above what's normal, normally there.
Right. And so we're hoping that if we deliver a little extra oomph from the outside via this microbial component, that we'll be able to sort of protect that environment from those DNA damage breaks that are coming from the radiation.
So we spoke with Miguel Jimenez, and it was really funny, Sarah, because he called him, and I love this term. He said, okay, well, when you're going to space, you and your crew, like your 99% of your cells is your crew as well. They're going to space with you. Yep. He says, we're going to provide the backup crew for the microbiome.
Oh, I love that.
Okay,
I'm going to have to steal that. I love that. We're the backup.
Crew.
Yes.
But what you're doing is actually arming the backup crew with some additional weapons.
Yes. Yes. We're souping them. We say we're souping them up.
Souping them up.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah.
Each crew member will have their own personal dosimeter. So we will have, from the measurement of physical dose, each crew member should have their own way of doing that. Wherever you go, you would have a personal dosimeter that was actively counting and actively able to provide you with some sort of feedback of what your dose is going to be.
So just for people to understand, the active dosimetry gives you real-time measurements.
Real time.
As opposed to just wearing something, if you're a nuclear worker, that just collects it over time, and once a month they come and check you.
Right, and you turn your badge in and they make a reading.
And you have no idea what you got over the time. So you need active real-time.
Active personal dosimetry.
Okay.
I think that's key.
We cannot completely shield against radiation in deep space, and the longer the exposure, the more damage to the humans. Trish is developing unique approaches to make humans more resilient to space radiation. The challenge of keeping humans healthy in space propels us to innovate in ways that continue to enhance how we live here on Earth.
The things that are happening with Trish, I think, absolutely apply to everyone's life here on Earth, even though we're looking at it from a space exploration standpoint, and to improving life here on Earth. But they also, just like what we're trying to do at Trish, looking at exploring further off the planet, what we're doing here on Earth with things like space-themed art therapy apply directly to an astronaut who's not going to see Earth as Earth out the window anymore when they're traveling to Mars at the shortest distance of 35 million miles away.
The more we see the integration in the body, the more we understand about it, and the more we understand about the basis for it. There's a genetic basis at the very bottom, but all these hazards of being in space flight all can drive different pieces of it that all come together to create the whole that is cognitive behavior, the behavioral performance, because it's affected by loss of gravity and the way your mind gets changed by that. It's affected by radiation. It's affected by the hostile environment that you're in, what chemicals are in the environment. It's affected by isolation and confinement, which these missions are going to, all these things come together and they affect a person's ability to perform and behave the way that they have been trained to behave for a long period of time.
So as a microbiologist, I'm fascinated by a certain universe, which is a universe we really can't see, and the microscopic one, and specifically the one that lives within us and on us, as I brought up before. And so this concept that universe that I've decided to dedicate my life towards understanding and manipulating and ideally coming up with cures could also help us better understand and reach the other universe that we've been staring on for a long time was just spectacular.
NASA, Trish, we all need to have to be a yes zone. Yes, we can achieve those dreams. Then surely with a change in the conversation, the STEAM division, we can hopefully raise up everyone. And as you know, we have really tough challenges. We have humans in space. We want them to be healthy and well and not just survive, but thrive.
Human spaceflight is not the domain of any single nation. It's a collective effort that's done on behalf of humanity.
Let's bring the best of what lives within us to empower the bravest of us.
Trish, the people that are participating, they're going in believing there are perhaps unusual solutions to some very challenging problems.